We are the forgotten generation, a misplaced slice of the 20th century when birth rates were as low as expectations for the future. We lived under the threat of constant nuclear annihilation, playing outside, but always inherently knowing the future was indoors. We are the second half of Generation X. We were some of the first to play video games, program home computers, and record CDs to cassette mixtapes. Our generation was nourished by new wave, imperfect punk rock, and John Hughes movies. We built Web 1.0 from the ground up using our childhood 8-bit and 16-bit programming skills. They call us Gen X. We prefer the vertical blank generation, where magic happens between the lines, because that's where we live, love, and thrive. We are Generation Atari.
Into the vertical blank.
Jeff, what'd you get for Christmas?
Well, I got a lot of Switch games. Unfortunately, my son stole the Switch and put it in his bedroom. But before he stole it and put it in his bedroom, I played a lot of Atari Flashback Classic. And
is that the new one for the Switch with 150 games or so?
It's got 150 games. It comprises all three of the releases that they've done for the Xbox and PlayStation 4 by now.
Wow, that must have every Atari game on it.
You would think so, but it's missing one.
What game is that, Jeff?
Well, let me put it this way. It even includes 5,200 games.
That's crazy.
And it includes just doubles and triples of some games based on 2,600, 5,200, and arcade. But
I find that a little questionable, by the way, to put all those. Like, do you really need the 2,600 version?
Nope, you don't need the 2,600 version if you have the arcade version. But it's interesting to have.
But no 7,800 games.
No 7,800 games, which was a huge omission because they could have put my favorite game on if they'd done that or the arcade.
What game is that, Jeff?
Food Fight.
Don't you mean Charlie Chuck's Food Fight?
Well, I never called it Charlie Chuck's Food Fight back in the day, and I'm not quite sure I know anyone who did, but yeah.
I think I remember that being on the title screen or something. Charlie Chuck or on the
I'll have to look it.
I knew that name, but yeah, I don't remember that appearing on any of the retro collections we have anywhere.
I don't have it, and there was one chance to get it, which was in the game room for Xbox 360 that was created by Chrome Studios. However, just plugged in the 360 and tried to load game room, and it's not there. In fact, most of my game room, there's no game room at all anymore. So all the purchase I made, gone.
Yeah, I know. That's kind of, and that's the danger of buying things digitally. It's why people want to use their own retro emulators and stuff, because, with their own ROMs, because these collections go away. Well, what about MAME? Have you tried it on MAME?
Well, I have. Originally, I played it on MAME, and I couldn't figure out what the problem was with it. It does play fun, and it works well, and everything's there. And I didn't understand why, and I think it's the control. Because the control was I think it was 360 degrees with a 60. Actually, it was an interesting 360 movement, because I remember you could throw the watermelons in many more directions than you can now on the 7800 version. So on MAME, it's fun, but you still only have 8-way control. And so there's something different about it.
Okay, but what's so weird is that there's lots of other games with not great controls that Atari has put out on these retro collections.
Well, yeah.
Case in point, all this, what?
Tempest,
anyway. All the Atari sports games that came out on those new collections, like the trackball controls are really hard. Breakout is awful on those collections. Right. So I can't see just crappy controls being the reason. In fact, I think, Jeff, we've discovered a mystery.
You think there's a mystery?
The mystery is the disappearance of Charlie Chuck.
Yeah, kind of.
Okay, wait, this gives me an idea. Let me cue something up for you. Looking at the game lists for existing barcades and arcades, in 2019, as well as the contents of all the various retro collections that have been released on video game platforms, you'd be hard-pressed to find a game that was not represented. But if you look closer, you might find several games that don't appear in many places. And one of those games stands out as one of the best games made in the golden age of the arcade. A game that gets little respect, and a game that hardly shows up anywhere. And that game is Atari's Charley Chuck's Food Fight. What happened to Charley Chuck? From Into the Vertical Blank, this is Crime Story, the disappearance of Charley Chuck.
What was that? What is up with that deep voice, Steve?
Well, like in the other podcasts I listen to, like those true crime podcasts, they always have some guy with a really deep, grizzled voice. If you ever listen to the new Vindication
I've heard
on Gimlet or Crime Town, they always sound like it's like a hard-boiled gumshoe detective or some grizzled police veteran of like 30 years. So it always sounds like they have to have a guy like that. So our true crime podcast has to have a deep voice.
Well, okay. This is not Raymond Chandler, and you're not Mickey Spillane. So stop it. Just stop it, okay? It's okay, but no more.
Okay, I don't think I'm going to do that because we're going right into the rest of the true crime podcast right now. For the record, Mr. Jeff Fulton, can you tell me where was the first time you met this Charley Chuck?
The first place I met Charley Chuck was at the Castle Park Arcade in Redondo Beach, California.
Can you describe what it was like to play games at the Castle Park Arcade?
Castle Park Arcade, you would walk in through two giant wooden doors like a castle, and off to your right were some pinball machines, and off to the left were some old school arcade games like Avalanche and Space Invaders. And then as you went through the arcade, getting towards the snack stand and then the other exit, which went out to miniature golf, you got all kinds of other arcade games. And usually what would happen was as you went further and further down the line, newer and newer games would show up. And then there was a set of skee-ball machines far off to the left, and those skee-ball machines next to them would always be the newest arcade games. So that would be a bank of Donkey Kong machines. And somewhere in the middle of the arcade was a food fight machine that I found, and that's the first time I met Charley Chuck. They only had one, and it was stuck in the middle of the arcade machines that were relatively new. My guess right now is that it was near Atari Space Duel, and next to that, at least for a little while, was Charley Chuck's Food Fight. And on the other side of that was a Tron Deadly Discs machine that I had never played before.
Food Fight was a coin-operated game released by Atari in April 1983. In the issue of Coin Connection, Atari's publication for arcade operators about their arcade games, they described Food Fight this way. Atari presents a madcap video feast in Food Fight. This game is sure to satisfy the cravings of your most ravenous players as they meet lovable, laughable Charley Chuck, who must dodge all kinds of flying fruit and vegetables in order to catch and eat an ice cream cone before it melts. It's a high caloric comedy caper with a leading character that will melt your heart. How many ice cream cones can Charlie Chuck consume? Your player will soon find out as they maneuver Chuck with the 360-degree analog joystick and right-handed, left-handed throw button to the other side of the screen where the ice cream cone awaits, acting as a wave timer as it drips down the game seconds. He must get past Oscar, Angelo, Jacques, and Zorba, 4 different types of chefs who unexpectedly pop out of holes, pursue Chuck, and throw food at him. Each has a unique behavior pattern, and they all intend to prevent Chuck from reaching that ice cream cone. If Chuck manages to get to the ice cream cone in time, he can eat it in one huge gulp and move on to a new game level and a different flavor of ice cream. But if he is hit by thrown food or caught by one of the pesky chefs, all the food on the screen flies straight at him, causing him to roll his big, blue, googly eyes and lose a life. Shucks, poor Chuck. There are piles of tomatoes, peas, bananas, pies, and watermelon that Chuck can use to defend himself from the persistent chefs. Each food reacts differently when thrown, and Chuck never runs out of watermelon ammo. A special feature exclusive to New Food Fight is the instant replay. This entertainment spectacle is proving to have tremendous player attraction at the game's test locations. If Chuck has a close call and is nearly hit by food, an accurate reproduction of the play action immediately preceding can occur, accompanied by the Food Fight musical theme. The player has no control over the playfield during an instant replay, so he can just stand back and enjoy Chuck's lucky break. Gameplay then resumes to normal. Bonus points are awarded for eating the ice cream cone and for the unused food left on the screen at the end of the wave. There are 125 total game levels programmed, and with each progressive one, Charlie Chuck encounters more chefs and more holes. Your players' appetites will never be satisfied once they've met Food Fight's cast of characters. They'll indulge themselves in game after game of Charlie Chuck's zany escapades. Atari's Food Fight is tantalizing fun no one can resist.
I remember I had never seen anything like it before. I think the attract mode, it looked a little bit like Robotron, which is a game I liked. And you see the attract mode, him running, and it's an instant replay, and his giant head goes around the ice cream cone and the food flies up. I think it was like, what is this game? I have to try it. And then eventually, I probably over a year span put so many quarters in that machine because it just became my favorite machine. Well, of course, I love the instant replay, but my favorite feature was the watermelons, because the watermelon was an unlimited supply of ordnance that you could fire at the chefs. And also, I love trying to figure out a way to get an instant replay. So it seemed to me that if there was a near miss on you, or you stayed a long time on the screen, especially on the ones that had the watermelons and killed a lot of guys, you get an instant replay. Food Fight was a very interesting game. It was more of a sports game than a shooting game to me. The reason being that it was almost like football to me. And this is the early 80s, and we had the Rams and the Raiders, and we had lots of sports. I was into sports. I played sports. I played soccer. I actually like sports video games. And Food Fight to me was the idea of running from one side to the other side of the screen and eating the cone, and dodging had a lot to do with football to me. And then the throwing aspect almost was like combining football and dodgeball together. Now, dodgeball, not a favorite game of mine, but that's what made the game so fun. Supposedly, all of the chefs had different personalities, like Pac-Man's ghosts. I'm not 100% sure I recognized any of that, and I don't even know the names. I'm sure that each chef had his own name. I don't really know their names. I didn't really catch that. In the arcade game, you weren't really catching that. Later on, maybe in the 7800 instruction manual, I probably read about about them and thought it was really cool. They each had a name and a personality, but that's not what you focused on when you played the game. The game is frantic. You were focused on throwing food and running towards that cone. That's what made the game so awesome. There were different types of food on the levels. I remember the banana levels being very good and the watermelon levels being very good. I like the banana ones because when you threw the bananas, they spun, and it was almost like throwing like some sort of shuriken or something from a kung fu or karate movie or something like that. Each piece of fruit seemed like a different type of weapon, even though it was the same. It had the same effect.
Did you ever play Food Fight in an arcade after you played it at Castle Park in Redondo Beach, California?
No, I have not. I could never find another machine. Arcades, we didn't go to much after this game came out. In high school, we didn't go to the arcade very much. Things changed. That area wasn't the greatest in the world at the time. It got a little bit more run down where that arcade was, where that Castle Golf was.
But let's turn for a minute to the character of Charlie Chuck. Who was Charlie Chuck, and what effect did he have on gamers at the time, like Jeff Fulton?
Well, to be honest, at the time, I didn't even associate him as Charlie Chuck. That was only later when I got into MAME and found out the name of the game was Charlie Chuck's Food Fight. It may have said it on the machine, but I wasn't that aware of my surroundings, especially in that arcade. Actually, I was more worried about, the surroundings of the other people at the arcade than what it said on the marquee. But I know it said Food Fight. As a character, I think Charlie Chuck was great because he had his big head and he has this huge giant mouth that could eat the cones. And it was a character that actually could have been used in a lot of other games. And why it wasn't, I'm not sure. I think because of the nature of the character, it was a perfect Nintendo-style character that could have been used in side-scrollers, shoot-'em-up games, pretty much anything. In fact, Charlie Chuck really is the ultimate shoot-'em-up game. It's just food.
So what's going on here? An amazing game, a great character, but a disappearance, almost off the face of the earth. We aim to find out what happened. This is The Disappearance of Charlie Chuck.
Okay, well, that was really interesting, but how do we go about solving this mystery, Steve?
Well, Jeff, we tracked down the creator and programmer of Food Fight, Jonathan Hurd, to see if he could shed some light on all of this. Are you ready to put on your interview hat, Mr. Jeff Fulton?
I know, I gotta look under a chair and see where this voice is coming from, but yeah, sure, I'll put on my interview hat.
My name is Jonathan Hurd. In late 1981 through mid 1984, I worked at a company called GCC, General Computer Company, and we created a bunch of video games for Atari, I think roughly 70 titles in that range, and also Ms. Pac-Man and Junior Pac-Man for Bally Midway. I started there after having met the founder when I was working at a company called Strategic Planning Associates, which is a strategy consulting firm. And I got hired there right out of MIT, where I did my degree in computer science. I really wanted to be a software engineer. And so when the GCC founder, who I had hired as a summer intern, and his other founders started up GCC, soon thereafter, they got a deal with Atari to develop games for them. And he knew my capabilities and said, why don't you come work for us? And I thought, great, this is what could be a better job, making video games. And my, first day on the job was a little bit before Christmas in 1981, and I went into, his name was Kevin Curran, went into Kevin's office and said, so, my background, what should I do to get started here? And Kevin said, come up with an idea for a video game, build it, and we'll all get rich. And I said, oh, that sounds great to me. By the way, that first day on the job, I also noticed that my new colleagues were putting the finishing touches on Ms. Pac-Man, the arcade game. And I said, hey, can I help you guys? They were under the gun. And Mike Horowitz, who was one of the developers of Ms. Pac-Man, said, yeah, her lips are looking a little funny. Could you see if you can fix them up? And so I spent a few minutes working on the pixels around the red and yellow pixels around her lip, and then they sent out the ROMs to Bally Midway. So I always say I helped put the finishing touches on Ms. Pac-Man's lips.
That's awesome. And Miss Pac-Man was a 6502 assembly language. Was it in a Z80 or what was?
That was based on Z80, as was Pac-Man, and Ms. Pac-Man was implemented initially as a daughter board that plugged onto a Pac-Man. So it was originally an intensive kit. But then I believe after some period of time, and as the popularity grew, it was a lot cheaper to incorporate it into the Pac-Man hardware. But actually, I'm not 100% sure about that. I have a...
No, I think you're correct. We've heard lots of stories about that. I mean, the lore about Crazy Otto turning into Pac-Man, and then Midway having the license to disappear, and of course Namco, it was a Namco game, and however it works. There's all kinds of fingers that touched it, but Miss Pac-Man turns out to be one of my favorite games of all time. So it's good to hear that you made the finishing touches on that one.
GCC, the company, were a group of MIT college students who built speed-up kits for video games. These speed-up kits were gray market items that let arcade operators get a little bit more money for the games they already own. One of those games they built a speed-up kit for was Atari's Missile Command. They began selling the speed-up kit from their dorm at MIT. Atari got wind of it and sued them for millions of dollars. But sooner or later, Atari realized that it might be better to have these brilliant MIT students on their side, and so they hired them instead to make video games for Atari. At first, GCC made arcade games, including Quantum, an unreleased game called Nightmare, and of course, the game we're talking about, Food Fight.
Well, who came up with the idea for Food Fight, and if it was you, how did you come up with the idea?
Yeah, it was me, and the way I came up with the idea, given Kevin Curran's direction to come up with an idea for a video game, build it, we'll all get rich. So, I was a fairly avid video game player, but I also had a job during the day. So now I had plenty of, time to really think about this and just focus on it. So I played a lot of games. We had a few in the office, but I also went to arcades. And I was thinking, I want something that isn't shooting at people. There were tons of games that involve shooting, obviously. And I thought, that's not great in terms of attracting women to play. And also, wouldn't it be great to have a game that just has more of a fun tone to it? So I thought, what else could the fire button be on a game? And I thought, throw, because I play baseball. And okay, what could we throw? And then food popped into my mind. And then I immediately thought, that is the perfect idea for a video game. Call it Food Fight. And then I thought I better do this game before anyone else realizes that there could be a game called Food Fight that would involve throwing food. So I was, the moment I thought of that, I was very inspired to just get things moving as quickly as possible. So I wrote a game proposal, and I actually had the date jotted down, January 4th, 1982.
Wow. So,
and I ran it past Kevin Curran, Doug McRae, the other founders, and there were 9 people at GCC, and people thought, hey, this seems like it could be a good idea. And it's actually pretty remarkable how close in terms of gameplay the original proposal was to what we ultimately created.
Well, I mean, on that note, Food Fight, as I mentioned, this is Jeff, as I mentioned, Miss Pac-Man is one of my favorite games of all time. Food Fight is my favorite game of all time. And I'm not just saying that. You can ask Steve. We
It's
had
his
to have-
favorite game of all time.
We had to have an Atari 7800 when I was turning 17. So it's like, I should have been doing other stuff, which I was, but I had to have Atari 7800 because Food Fight was on that machine. It was like the only thing I wanted to play.
Wow.
And to me, Food
Well,
Fight was a game of football where you threw things at the other players. Because you had to get from one side of the screen to the other and eat the cone. And you also had, so it had like these elements of like a sports game, which I wasn't necessarily that much into sports games, but it just did, along with the elements that it was like a sports game mixed with Robotron. Because you had like that goal, and anyway, great game. That everything about it. I mean, we go through in this podcast before describing it, but the instant replay, the watermelons, especially, just everything about it is 100% awesome. Anyway.
Plus, the non-violent nature is really cool too. You know, at a few years before Narc came out and just blew everything away in the non-violent space, like it was like a real, I think, milestone in like how to create a non-violent, awesome sort of action game.
So, well, thank you very much, because I did want it to be non-violent. I also wanted to make it easy to learn at the outset. In other words, easy to just do level 1 and not get totally discouraged. But also, if you stuck with it and you get up to the max level, level 125, it is a lot like Robotron. And to me, Robotron was one of the, I think it's the best game ever from a pure gameplay and controls perspective. It's tough to master with the 2 joysticks. But once you master Robotron, the level of feeling of danger and your ability to get out of seemingly impossible situations, is what's so cool. And there's a certain amount of that in Food Fight as well. So it's really high action, but it's also approachable for someone who is a more casual player in the earlier rounds.
Well, I do want to eventually ask you what the algorithm is for creating an instant replay, because it seems to me that if you get out of sticky situations, it happens. But I don't know how you would calculate that with math.
Yeah. So, I can tell you right now if you want. So, first of all, I got the idea for instant replay because there was a whole lot of RAM. Food Fight has 8 kilobytes of RAM, so very, very little RAM, but not all of it was really needed to keep track of where all the foods and chefs and characters were. So I realized I had about half of it left over, and I thought, that's interesting. And I thought a couple of times when I was playing, boy, I wish I could watch that again. And so I realized, all I have to store is the position of the joystick and the state of the throw button. And I had a random number. There is randomness, but it's all based on a random number seed. So as long as I kept track of that and the state of the throw button and the joystick throughout, I could recreate any round. And so I did that and tried it. And then, of course, many of the rounds are pretty boring. So it just felt like a boring intrusion if it just popped up randomly. So what the software does is it looks for a close call of piece of food almost hitting you, in other words, as well as a close call of a chef almost catching you. So there has to be both a near food and a near chef combined with, I think it's 8 seconds or something, that you have to go at least 8 seconds for an instant replay to be generated. And then a very cool thing, Patty Goodson is a composer we hired, and she wrote this instant replay music, and she wrote 8 different versions of it. And then based on the length of the instant replay round, I would choose which of the 8 versions, like some of them had a chorus or whatever, and others didn't. And so choose which version and also then slightly speed it up or slow it down so that it matched the exact time between the start and when Charlie Chuck eats the ice cream cone.
Who else you did? You mentioned Patty. I think it was Patty who did the music. Who else was on the team? Was it just you and a music or a sound designer, or were there more people on the team?
No, it's quite a few. And really a short answer to the question is everybody at GCC
Got it.
seemed to contribute in one way or another, because we had an environment where, we had offices when we needed to just go and think and immerse ourselves in solving some problem. We could go into them, but we also had all these game stations around a central lab area. And so I would have the current version of Food Fight up and running, and people would come by and play it. And then they would have ideas, and I'd keep track of ideas and think about, can that be incorporated, or should we change that in some way? So everyone was contributing. I want to start out by saying that. And then, but there were people that contribute a lot more than others, and their initials are in the high score table when the game starts up. My initials are in there, followed by Tom Westberg. He was the game's hardware designer. Roland Janberg contributed many ideas and wrote a lot of the code also, especially at the beginning when we were rushing to get prototype ready to show Atari demos. Atari executives periodically came to visit us. Bruce Burns also worked on the original prototype with me in January 1982. We actually did the very original prototype on Pac-Man hardware on a Z80. So we mocked it up in Z80 assembly language, and then we later ported it to Tom Westberg's hardware.
Now, was that a 68,000? What hardware did you report it to? What was the final hardware?
Yeah, so the actual platform was based on the 68,000. It was, as far as I'm aware, the first 16-bit arcade game, and it was great because it gave us a lot of power to have 32 objects flying around on the screen, and even with that and that faster clock speed compared to the 8-bit processors that were out there at the time, still had to do a fair amount of optimization of the code. And the other advantage of the 68,000 is that there was effectively a beta C compiler that was available for it on the emulator hardware that we were using. And so I was able to write most of Food Fight in C as opposed to assembly language, but due to a combination of bugginess and inefficiency of the C compiler, I still wrote some of the tighter loop in 68,000 assembly language. When you can write most of the game in C and handle stuff that is not really time sensitive, it gives you a lot of flexibility into making changes very quickly. And I also see it, plain old regular C is not object oriented, but I kind of implemented the software in something resembling an object oriented way. So my whole goal was to make it as flexible as possible during development so that we could adapt gameplay easily and make sure that it was fun. And there's a lot involved there in terms of timing, of how fast do things move, and how fast do various foods fly and everything, and how complex does the game get in early rounds, and how much does it accelerate as you go through. It just gave a lot more flexibility to have the software in high level language.
No, I didn't realize that it's probably one of the earliest arcade games written in a higher level language.
One interesting aspect of the development of the Food Fight coin-op was that it was built with the Motorola 68000 microprocessor. It was one of the first games that used the Motorola 68000 microprocessor, and was also one of the first games programmed in C. But one wonders, is this reliance on the Motorola 68000 one of the reasons why the game has not been seen in any retro collections? We asked this question directly to Code Mystics, the company that built the last 3 Flashback Classic game packs, as well as Atari Vault, and this is what they had to say. Focal, our emulation technology, does support the 68000 code. For example, we've released a variety of Neo Geo games, as well as Atari game titles like Gauntlet, Marble Madness, etc., which are all 68000 based. The games that we do for Atari are chosen in consultation with Atari. We'd be happy to do any game they want. Whether they would like to include Food Fight is up to them. Emulating the hardware appeared to be an interesting clue, but quite possibly it's simply a red herring.
I want to ask you a little bit of question about the legacy. I know you only worked for about, sounds like you only worked for about till 84 there.
That's right. Yeah, it was about 2.5 years.
And my guess is that everything was time and materials with Atari, or were there royalties that you guys got back from the from the games you created?
Yeah, as I recall, there was a flat acceptance fee. So when they said, we like this prototype, we're going to proceed with it, and go forward. And there was some kind of a reimbursement also for development costs. And then there was like a final acceptance fee, and then there was a share after that of any profits that went above those acceptance fees. So it was, for a game that was a big hit, it could have been, and for some games I'm sure it was, a significant number. I just know for Food Fight itself, there was, there was a set amount, and I think the game had so few, it might have been 2,500 arcade units or something in that range, not much compared to, like a Ms. Pac-Man that, as far as I know, did around 100,000 units in that range. So I don't think there was any more after the initial payment in terms of royalties for Food Fight, because it really was introduced right as the video game market was crashing.
Did you ever go look to play the 7800 version? I'm sure it wasn't easy to get. The 7800 sold a couple of million units, but it wasn't like an NES or anything like that. So and I was very involved with helping Keith Sawyer, who actually did the conversion. So I was working upstairs. We had 2 levels. He was working downstairs, and so I had well-documented source code, which helped a lot. But he had to also make sure the tweaks were made so that it ran appropriately on the 7800. And he did a great job implementing the game on the 7800, and so it was all happening while I was there. And even the development we did the 7800 hardware for Atari. Well, that's right. Of course. I didn't know if you were there at the time though for that, but of course you were, because I think it came out I think it was announced in somewhere around 84. So you must have been working on it before that. What do you think about Charlie Chuck as a character? Because obviously, with only 2,500 units sold of the machine, but then a lot of cartridges for the 7800, Atari not having very many characters, we always thought, we wondered why Charlie Chuck, even popularity in, not as big as Mario, right? But what a character. It's already created a side view character with a big head who has personality. Why do you think maybe that didn't go on to be used in other games?
Well, that's I think Charlie Chuck, from a character development perspective, in many ways was never really born. I mean, he's in the game, but there's virtually nothing about him except he has a giant head and a big tongue and smiles in a satisfied way when he eats the cone. But beyond that, there's nothing about him that developed him as a character.
Well, there wasn't in I'm sorry to be interrupt you at all. There wasn't in Donkey Kong either for Jumpman, which was Mario. But Nintendo went ahead and made game after game. GCC, something happened to GCC and Atari's relationship, and we kind of felt that if that had continued in some way further along the line, there might have been some more Charlie Chuck, or there might have been a bigger appreciation in the overall video game world for this character in this game.
Well, the one game that I thought would have been a lot of fun is a 2-player version of Food Fight, and I'm not sure who Charlie Chuck would have gone up against there, but
Detective Voice Steve thinks a character named Harry Hurl would have been the perfect foil for Charlie Chuck in a 2-player game of Food Fight.
You could imagine 2 people both racing to eat the cone, but also potentially cooperating around hitting chefs. And so, rather than a 2-player game where you're alternating, there could be, so that was one game I thought of that would make a lot of sense as a kind of follow-up to Food Fight. But in terms of Charlie Chuck, the character, I think the name of the game with Charlie Chuck in it implies probably a lot more emphasis on him as a character than we sort of ever envisioned. And we were always thinking, and I still believe the most important thing about games is gameplay. I mean, if you have a noticeable character like E.T. or something, but a terrible game based around E.T., that drags down the character name, but you could have a really great game with an unknown character from a pure gameplay perspective. And yeah, it might take a while longer for people to discover it and everything, but it's like, I don't know, I think maybe Mario Brothers, even if the character hadn't evolved from Donkey Kong, still would have been as popular. So I don't think the character migrating from Donkey Kong to Mario really had a whole lot of impact on the success of Mario, actually.
Yeah, it was the gameplay, obviously, in the first Mario Brothers and Super Mario Brothers. When you mentioned the 7800 version was being made at the same time as your version?
Well, it was made after Food Fight was finished, which is always, when you're doing a conversion from one platform to another, it's a lot more efficient to do it after the game is completely developed, know? So, yeah.
So did you guys ever have any interaction with the Atari games people? First off, you were there during the non-Atari Tramiel year. So before Atari was sold, because you were there through 1984. But were you there when that sale happened? Did anything happen to GCC at that time? Because I know the relationship continued in some way.
Yeah, I left before we started developing Mac software for the Apple Macintosh, rather. And so I was on this team initially. I effectively stopped becoming a game developer in late 1983 and started planning software for the Apple Macintosh. And then at that point, I decided, if I'm not going to be a game developer, and we could all see the industry was crashing, right? So we were, as a company, looking for the next hot thing to do. So, but I personally wanted to write software with a different startup. I got recruited out, essentially. So I joined another startup, but a year and a half later, I was back at GCC because they had created this internal hard disk for the Apple Macintosh called Hyperdrive.
Oh.
And we ended up having a company that grew to be a $50 million-ish range supplier of Macintosh printers and hard disks. So it was a GCC branded.
Wow.
GCC,
that's incredible.
GCC technology branded. So the company made a complete transition to something completely different from video games. And it was really all catalyzed by the video game industry taking that massive downturn when it did.
Well, there obviously personal computers was, in the U.S. at least, to the kids that grew up with playing Food Fight, that time. Personal computers became the next big thing. So you started on Miss Pac-Man, worked on Food Fight for GCC. Did you work or help on any other titles? I think you said everybody helped, but is there anything?
Yeah, so I worked with Tim Hoskins and Bruce Burns again on Junior Pac-Man. So that was there was Food Fight and Quantum, which were released by Atari roughly the same time. And then Junior Pac-Man, which had a scrolling screen, and that was released by Bally Midway. And so I did work more in an advisory capacity on that. I didn't write any of the software. And we had a bunch of games under development, and I was in charge of keeping things moving on the other games, but none of the others got to market as arcade games after that. As the industry was crashing and our relationship with Atari was wrapping up, none of those others actually got to market.
Well, there's a lot of GCC developed Atari 2600 games too. So I think there was a Pac-Man that's just incredible. I mean, it's one of the best games on the system is Junior Pac-Man for the 2600, and there are a lot like Stargate, I think, and I'll have to look. But there are a lot of them that you guys worked on.
Yeah, the team that I actually didn't myself work on any of the cartridge-based games, but the teams that were doing that had incredible constraints.
I think one of the things I want to ask you is, what are you doing now? Now, you started doing Mac software, and then what did that bring your career around to in the last 35 years? Is it?
Oh, scary the amount of time, huh? Well, so I was at GCC primarily as a software engineer and project manager in the Mac software days, and then I got into Harvard Business School, and so I went to business school for a couple of years. When I got out, I was a marketing executive, including time at GCC, my third stint there, and then I was looking around for the next thing, and I thought, hey, I went to Harvard Business School. I should look into being a strategy consultant to see if that's a possibility. And I got hired by a strategy consulting firm called Mercer Management Consulting, and that was 26 years ago, roughly.
Wow.
So for the past 26 years, I've been a strategy consultant at 3 different firms, but my current firm is called Altman Valandry and Company, and we are a strategy consulting firm focused on technology, media, and telecom. And we have 140 people, and so we do things like designing new video offers. So what combinations of content at what price point will drive various levels of demand. So content strategy as well for cable networks and broadcast networks. And as a firm, we also do a lot of work in technology infrastructure, so fiber operators and how and where to deploy fiber, as well as different kinds of software companies. And it's mostly corporate strategy and marketing strategy work.
I have 2 questions for you. One, do you have any interesting stories about working at GCC or with Atari or anything weird that happened that you wanted to that you haven't told anyone before? You'd really like to get off your chest?
Well, one that comes to mind is, developing Food Fight, we really did it very quickly, but also had a lot of refinement based on watching people play. So I used to take the prototype game cabinet, and we had a relationship with Fun and Games Arcade in Framingham, Mass, and put it in the back of a station wagon, take it over there and set it up in Fun and Games, just like the other games there, except it had a black cabinet. And then I would sit there and watch people play Food Fight and just think about, and I had various statistics I kept track of, like how long did they spend in each level compared to, when did they abandon it or put more money in? Because you can, in the arcade game, if you put a quarter in relatively soon after finishing a game, you can go up to the level you achieved earlier.
Right.
So you don't have to start at level 1 every time. So that, I wanted to see how often that happened. So the goal was, find the right balance between simplicity and approachability, but also creating a challenge for other players. So anyway, while I was there, I thought, what would be really cool to catch people's eye would be a banana joystick instead of the, Red Baron joystick. So I got one of those plastic bananas that you get at a store that sells kitchen decorations, whatever, and filled it up with epoxy and inverted a joystick into it. And we had an actual banana joystick. The problem was the epoxy was so heavy that the first time in the arcade, prototype stage that somebody gave it a good shove, it just destroyed the joystick underneath. So, but I still think, wow, if we collaborated better with Atari on the joystick, it could have been a lot more fun and eye-catching, and also the just mechanical design of the joystick itself could have been a lot better.
Well, one thing, so the mechanical of the design of the joystick, the 360 degree, was remarkable. Do you know if that was used in any other games?
Well, it was definitely used in Red Baron, because that's, I took the joystick out of a Red Baron for the prototype. But after that, I really don't know. But I'll tell you one thing, it was a very unreliable joystick. Thinking back, that was the biggest weakness, because the games, the Food Fight games that were initially sold and that were on test, I read the test reports and see that, the game was broken. And it was inevitably due to the design of the underlying joystick mechanics. And because the Red Baron joystick wasn't meant to be shoved around the way you do with a Food Fight joystick. So anyway, that was a big issue and weakness with the game. And so having a more durable joystick would have been a big plus.
Doing a little research in other issues of Atari's Coin Connection magazine, we found a disturbing article in the spring 1984 edition. It's entitled, Atari Introduces Crystal Castles Conversion Kits. It says this: Bentley Bear is back. Now he's gathering more gleaming new profits, adding new players to a wide base of older games. Each wave of the conversion game still presents him with a tempting trail of ruby gemstones winding in and out and all around 16 different 3D Super Maze structures. Each kit includes all the electronics, hardware, instruction manuals, and graphic materials to completely convert your games. Order Crystal Castles Kit number 1 to convert upright Missile Command. Order Crystal Castles Kit number 2 to convert an upright Dig Dug, Kangaroo, Food Fight, or Arabian. Watch out for Crystal Castle kits coming soon. What is a conversion kit anyway? Arcade conversion kits were sold by arcade game manufacturers like Atari to arcade game owners so they could get the benefit of their existing investment in machines without having to pay for a brand new one. In this case, Atari sold kits to convert Food Fight, less than a year old, into a new game called Crystal Castles. Why does this matter? One only has to look at a document online called Atari Production Numbers, available in PDF format. On that list, which lists the prices and manufacturing numbers for Atari coin-ops, you can find out that Charley Chuck's Food Fight only had 1,951 arcade cabinets made. And how many Crystal Castles conversion kits were made? Up to 500. That means fully a quarter of the Food Fight machines could have completely disappeared and morphed into Crystal Castles. That means less than 1,500 of the machines could exist right now. What happened to Charley Chuck? One answer is he was converted into a different game and disappeared. It feels like a little bit of grand irony then that a company, GCC, that got started by making conversion kits for arcade games, including Atari's Missile Command, would then have a conversion kit made for its first real arcade game, Food Fight, by Atari itself, to convert it to a different Atari game, Crystal Castles. Was it planned that way, or just the way the arcade business was going in 1984?
To you, once you left, and did you look for it? Did you wonder why it didn't show up in any of these compilations that are coming around on the Xbox and things like that? Did you care?
Well, I love running into Food Fight, in an arcade, or someone who mentions it, or someone said they saw it in the latest Wreck-It Ralph. And
oh yes,
I once read an interview of the writer of the original Wreck-It Ralph, and he said his favorite game was Food Fight. So of course I love it whenever I hear anything like that. In terms of its being on compilation, so I definitely have some theories and some facts about that. So fact number one is I ran into, just very randomly, an Atari lawyer, and this was probably now 12, 13 years ago. And I said, yeah, I did, oh, you work for Atari. I did Food Fight. He goes, oh, Food Fight. Man, we have so many legal issues with that. And I said, oh, what do you mean? And he said, oh, trademarks on the name Food Fight. It's just, very tough to clear that because, it's kind of generic. That must be, and I'm not a lawyer, but that must be one issue. And then there was a movie called Food Fight that came out. There's probably other games called Food Fight that came, so I think that is definitely one of the challenges, is that it may be tough to do licensing or to enforce licensing.
The full name is Charley Chuck's Food Fight, right? So if it is the full name Charley Chuck's Food Fight, or is it Food Fight with Charley Chuck as sort of a subtitle?
It's a great question. I mean, the Atari, I believe it was Atari who suggested, why don't you give that character a name? There's one of my friends from MIT was working at GCC with me. Tim Hoskins is his name. He actually did Junior Pac-Man. And I said, hey, Tim, I'm trying to come up up with a name for this character. By the way, the character was, people joke with me, but designed to sort of look like me, which, blonde hair, blue eyes. That's about as far as the resemblance
Your
goes.
head is not that large.
No, I don't have that long tongue that comes out and eats the cone either. But so he came up with the idea for this name, Charley Chuck, and then we ran it by Atari, and they said, "Great, we're going to make this Charley Chuck's Food Fight," and that was what appeared on the cabinet graphics, up above. But on the game itself, there's Food Fight and these doughy characters, and it's clear the main character's name, Charley Chuck, in the intro screen. But I don't know exactly what happened in terms of how they trademarked it or what other intellectual property protections they put in place. But apparently it was a legal nightmare. So that's theory number one.
Searching tests, the U.S. government's patent and trademark office database. You can find one entry for Food Fight in reference to Atari. It was filed June 1983, registered February 12, 1985, and canceled May 19, 2000, and there are no other records. The U.S. copyright database has a little bit more than just one record. There are 4. One from March 15th, 1983 is the Food Fight Operator's Manual from Atari. On May 31st, 1984, the instructions for Food Fight were copyrighted along with those for Crystal Castles, Dig Dug, Arabian, and Kangaroo. On March 2nd, 1983, the computer file that consisted of one video cassette and descriptive materials for the video game were copyrighted by Atari in the U.S. government database. And finally, the Food Fight computer program was copyrighted June 16, 1986. This must be for the Atari 7800 and or Atari 8-bit version. But after that, nothing. No more references to any trademarks or copyrights for Charley Chuck or Food Fight.
The more important probably thing is that Food Fight uses an analog joystick.
Oh, yes.
We originally used a Red Baron joystick, and it's got potentiometers on kind of X, Y, so you can read the position around a grid of the joystick. And so I would take whatever the position was in that grid after it was converted from analog to digital, and then it determined the direction you were pointing based on where it was on the outer portion of the grid. And then in the middle of the grid, you could still point around, but you wouldn't move. So you can it's such a powerful control because you can sit on a watermelon, and as long as you don't move the joystick into the outer edge, you can throw in any direction, one of 64 different directions.
So that is the one difference between the 7800 version and the arcade version, of course, is playing the 7800 version. You can do that because I think they built in a way to stop and throw, but the arcade version where you basically almost have, seems like 360 degrees of chucking watermelon is one of the most awesome gaming experiences I've ever had. That's why you know that. You made my childhood, well, my teenagehood.
So I actually recently did run into, at an inn in Vermont, in their game room, a compilation machine that did have Food Fight on it. It may have used MAME as the base. I'm not sure how they did it, but it had an 8-way joystick. And when you've got a full-size, arcade screen and the original resolution of Food Fight, you really lose something in the game experience because A, you can't point without moving, and B, there are certain directions you can't throw in. So you probably are familiar with the way you enter your initials for the high score table, where there's a ring of letters and you throw food at the letters. Well, you can't throw at a lot of the letters with the 8-way joystick. And so I think, the other theory is that the control in a compilation machine, they're not going to put an analog joystick on there. So it really makes the game a lot less fulfilling to play.
Well, the game does play in MAME. I don't have a copy now. I think MAME for me got really difficult because after a while it was so hard to get the right ROMs and things. On an Xbox or even on a PC now, where you have these 360 degree sort of analog sticks. If created properly, you could do both Robotron, which is awesome to play with 2 sticks, and you could do Food Fight properly. I'm not sure anyone has though. I'm not sure there is a properly emulated version. One thing I do want to know about you personally is, do any of your colleagues know that you used to work on old Atari games?
They all end up finding out, because it's a fun fact that not only do I mention every now and then, but they tell each other too.
Does it come into like when those terrible icebreaker, when you come to go to one of the offsite meetings and there's an icebreaker and they're all, tell us something interesting about yourself. Did you ever pick that one above other things that you want to tell people?
The better question is, do I ever not pick that one?
Oh, okay, yeah.
No, I constantly bring it up, because not only was it so much fun and I was in the right place at the right time and just so lucky to be there, but also just the fact that there are still food fights running. I mean, how much software written in the early 80s is still running today?
Did you ever have family members or anything who have played any of the games that you worked on?
Oh, yeah. When my wife and I bought our first house and had our son, we had our food fight game actually in our dining room, and my son would stand on a milk box and play the game. So that's pretty cool to be able to see your own kid playing a game that you developed. It was about 10 years before that. So
wow, yeah, he must have some stories too, lucky kid. Is there anything about that time, or what you learned from that time that helped you in your current work?
I was really motivated to get this done fast, because I was so paranoid that someone else would come up with the idea. And actually, I think Williams, I saw in an arcade this game called Splat. Oh. And I heard through the grapevine that it was codenamed Food Fight when it was in development. I had the impression from playing it that they never really actually finished it, but someone else probably would have come out with a game called Food Fight if we hadn't gotten that up quickly. It may have just been a prototype only. I don't know.
For sure. There was a game that came out for the Atari ST called Mud Pies, which is basically throwing pies at clowns and running through rooms. It is nowhere near as good as your game at all, but it is the same concept. And it came out like in 85, so it definitely was a quote unquote, it was a ripoff of Food Fight in some way. But clowns and pies aren't as good as your game.
Oh, well, thanks. Well, anyway, the thing I learned is, if you can make progress on something on your own toward an end goal, do it. And it just so much requires collaboration with others. But if there are ways you can individually push the ball forward, do as much as you can to do that. And then obviously you have to collaborate as well. But it just, that initiative on pushing forward on your own makes such a huge difference.
Well, that's great. One last thing. Where do you think Charlie Chuck is right now? So the IP. So who do you think owns the IP for Charlie Chuck right now? If you had,
I would think it's Atari.
But okay, well,
he may be like still stuck in an orphanage, like Peter Pan, ever growing up and just on his own in an orphanage. I don't know.
So, does Atari still own the rights to Food Fight, or Charlie Chuck's Food Fight? Well, we did more research. In fact, we did very simple research. We did a simple search on the internet for the term Atari IP catalog. And what we came up with was very interesting. A PowerPoint document available to anyone free on the internet called 2015 Atari IP Catalog. And inside that IP catalog, on the second page, is listed Food Fight, and in parentheses, Charlie Chuck's. And if you click the hyperlink, it goes to a page that says Food Fight, Charlie Chuck's Food Fight. Atari does seem to know they own Charlie Chuck's Food Fight, but there's one little wrinkle. If you look at the second to last bullet point, it says this: developed for the Atari 7800 in 1983 by General Computer Corporation, creators of Miss Pac-Man. They only think they own the 7800 version. Does Atari even know they own the coin-op? Well, we sent an email to Atari to try to find out what their plans were for Food Fight in 2019. We could only find their press contact online, but we sent an email anyway, and we waited for 2 weeks, and finally we got a response, and this is what they had to say. No announcements regarding Food Fight, but Atari just did announce Food God's Food Truck Frenzy this week. Here's the trailer. As far as Charlie Chuck's Food Fight goes, according to Atari, there's no comment.
So there are lots of Atari fans out there. If there's anything you wanted to say to those people that are still stuck in Atari world?
I think it's really cool that you still care about Atari games, and it's just fun for me to see Food Fight pop up every now and then, and whether someone has a post about it, or it shows up in a movie, or I get a call from you guys, or whatever it is, it's really fun. So always thrilled to know that people still care about it.
So, in the end, there was no conspiracy. Charlie Chuck was not abducted, and he never really disappeared. No, Charlie Chuck and his game Food Fight were simply neglected, and now, most likely, live in legal hell with other patent, copyright, and trademark issues. Like so many games and systems that arrived at the tail end of Atari's reign in 1984, they live in a state of suspended animation, with a thought bubble over their heads that reads, "What could have been?" Even if neither Food Fight or Charlie Chuck ever live a full life again in the outside world, you know where they do live and thrive like 1983 never ended? I know you know the answer. Here, with us. With our guest Jonathan Hurd, with our memories that exist between the scan lines, right here in the vertical blank.
Now, good job. Hey, by the way, even though I'm recording this, good job with the script, man. It's awesome.
Okay. So, you want to introduce the new season of Into the Vertical Blank?
You want me to do this?
Go for it.
Into the Vertical Blank, Generation Atari.
Season 2.
Into the Vertical Blank, Generation Atari. Season 2.
Oh, wait. We both did that at the same time.
Okay. Do you want to say Season 2 and I don't say it?
Yes.
Into the Vertical Blank, Generation Atari.
Season 2. Coming at you now. Welcome to Into the Vertical Blank, Season 2.
Okay, who reads the next part?
Nah, there's no reading. You're not supposed to say read.
Next frame calculated. Prepare to write new data. V blank ending.